Security, would you kindly show the janitor's daughter where the exit is? The laughter rolled across the polished boardroom before anyone even bothered to learn her name. It echoed against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, blending with the faint hum of the city 40 stories below. Naomi Carter stood perfectly still beside the conference table, one hand resting on a small silver flash drive, her other hand wrapped around a worn notebook with frayed corners. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't argue. She simply waited, her calm expression almost out of place in a room filled with custom-tailored suits, expensive watches, and people accustomed to having every word treated as fact. Richard Whitmore, the company's celebrated CEO, leaned comfortably against the head of the massive walnut table, the confidence of a man who had spent 20 years believing no one in the room could challenge him. His smile carried the effortless certainty of privilege, the kind built from uninterrupted success and reinforced by countless people too intimidated to disagree. "This board meeting isn't a classroom," he said, barely disguising his amusement. "And it certainly isn't a place for someone who came in wearing a maintenance badge." A few executives exchanged knowing glances before quiet chuckles spread around the table. Someone whispered that the cleaning crew had apparently become very ambitious this morning. Another executive smirked as he reached for his coffee, never imagining the young woman near the projector could possibly belong anywhere except behind a mop bucket. Naomi's visitor badge still hung around her neck. It identified her as temporary facility support, the same category her father had carried for nearly 18 years inside Whitmore Dynamics. Samuel Carter spent every evening making sure the marble floors reflected the city lights like glass. Most employees passed him without ever asking his name. They remembered the spotless hallways, but rarely noticed the man responsible for them. Naomi knew those hallways almost as well as he did. As a little girl, she had waited there after school, sitting quietly outside conference rooms. While her father finished late-night shifts, she had colored pictures beside vending machines, completed homework on empty reception desks, and eventually found herself fascinated by the conversations drifting through partially closed doors. Words like acquisition, innovation, investment, and market expansion had sounded mysterious at first. Years later, they became subjects she studied with relentless determination. While other students spent weekends relaxing, Naomi spent hers borrowing business textbooks from the public library and watching free lectures online until sunrise. Scholarships covered tuition, but they never covered everything. So every evening after class, she still helped her father clean offices before catching the last train home. Neither of them complained. Samuel always reminded her that honest work never diminished honest dreams. This morning had begun like every other Tuesday. Naomi had arrived before 7, carrying cleaning supplies in one hand and her laptop in the other. Her father smiled as he adjusted his blue maintenance card and reminded her not to forget the regional entrepreneurship competition later that afternoon. She smiled back, knowing he had secretly skipped buying himself a new winter coat so she could afford the registration fee months earlier. Everything changed less than 30 minutes ago when the executive assistant rushed into the hallway looking panicked. The company's lead strategy consultant had become stranded at O'Hare after severe weather delayed every outbound flight. The board presentation scheduled to determine the future of Whitmore Dynamics had suddenly lost its presenter. Confusion spread across the executive floor. Phones rang nonstop. Assistants hurried between offices. Directors argued over revised agendas while investors were already arriving downstairs. Naomi happened to be replacing bottled water in conference room A when she quietly mentioned that she had seen a backup copy of the presentation stored on the secure company server during a routine equipment check the previous evening. She also mentioned, almost apologetically, that she had noticed several inconsistencies while verifying the projector. Software. The assistant had stared at her in disbelief before asking one impossible question. "You actually understand strategic forecasting?" Naomi answered with quiet honesty. "I study it every day." Minutes later, she found herself standing in front of the most powerful people she had ever seen. Yet before anyone asked what she knew, they noticed only the maintenance badge hanging from her neck. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The polished conference table reflected rows of puzzled faces, while the morning sunlight spilled through the towering glass walls and painted long streaks across the hardwood floor. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, refusing to let the weight of the room change who she was. She had learned years ago that silence often revealed more about people than words ever could. Richard Whitmore folded his arms and studied her with growing impatience, convinced that confidence without status was nothing more than misplaced courage. To him, she looked like another teenager who had wandered into a place she could never understand. What he could not see was everything that had happened long before this morning. Naomi had never dreamed about becoming rich. She dreamed about being heard. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, she watched her father leave home before sunrise and return long after dark, his work boots carrying the faint scent of floor wax and industrial cleaner. Samuel Carter never complained about the long hours or the aching knees that came from climbing endless flights of stairs with maintenance equipment. Instead, every evening he asked his daughter the same simple question. What did you learn today? It was never about grades. It was never about trophies. It was about curiosity. Their tiny apartment was filled with secondhand books instead of expensive furniture. Business magazines sat beside borrowed economics textbooks. Whiteboards covered with handwritten notes leaned against the living room wall because buying a proper desk had never fit into the monthly budget. Naomi often studied until midnight while her father quietly repaired old appliances for neighbors to earn extra money. On weekends, she followed him to office buildings where she helped refill supply closets or organize storage rooms after finishing her assignments. Most executives never noticed her. Some barely acknowledged Samuel beyond a quick nod. Yet Naomi listened carefully whenever conference room doors remained slightly open. She memorized the language of leadership before she ever stepped inside a business classroom. She learned that numbers told stories and that every successful company rose or fell because of decisions made around tables exactly like the one standing before her now. Her professors at the University of Illinois had noticed something unusual almost immediately. While many students repeated theories from textbooks, Naomi always asked why those theories failed in the real world. She spent countless nights analyzing public financial reports, studying market behavior, and building presentation models simply because solving complex problems made perfect sense to her. Last semester, one professor quietly told her that she explained difficult ideas with the clarity of someone twice her age. He encouraged her to enter national competitions, but travel costs, registration fees, and unpaid internships remained luxuries her family simply could not afford. So she continued balancing classes with evening maintenance shifts beside her father, believing that discipline mattered more than recognition. Samuel often reminded her that no honest job could ever reduce the value of an honest mind. Those words stayed with her every time strangers assumed she belonged only in service hallways. Back inside the boardroom, several executives continued exchanging skeptical glances. One director adjusted his glasses before whispering that they were wasting valuable time. Another quietly checked his watch, convinced this awkward interruption would end within seconds. Margaret Collins, the chairwoman of the board, remained unusually quiet. She had watched Naomi since the young woman entered the room. Unlike everyone else, Margaret noticed that Naomi never glanced around nervously searching for approval. Instead, her eyes naturally rested on the financial chart still, frozen across the projection screen. It was the same focused expression Margaret had seen on experienced analysts preparing billion-dollar recommendations. That small detail planted the first seed of doubt inside the room. Perhaps the maintenance badge explained where Naomi worked. It did not necessarily explain what she knew. Richard Whitmore slowly walked toward the panoramic windows, buttoning the front of his charcoal suit as though the interruption had already been resolved. Below, the Chicago River shimmered beneath the bright morning sun while streams of traffic crawled through the financial district like tiny silver threads. He had built Whitmore Dynamics into one of the fastest-growing technology firms in the Midwest, earning magazine covers, television interviews, and invitations to speak at elite business conferences across the country. Inside these walls, his judgment was rarely questioned. Investors trusted him. Employees admired him. Competitors feared him. Years of success had quietly convinced him that excellence always arrived wearing expensive suits, prestigious university credentials, and polished introductions. That belief had become so deeply rooted that he no longer realized he carried it into every meeting. To Richard, opportunity belonged to those who already looked successful. The boardroom itself reflected that philosophy. Every leather chair had been custom-made. Every piece of artwork had been selected to symbolize ambition and achievement. Crystal water glasses caught the sunlight, casting delicate reflections across neatly organized financial reports. Nothing inside the room appeared accidental. Every detail projected authority. Richard expected every person sitting around the table to reinforce that image. Naomi's presence disrupted more than his meeting. She disrupted his assumptions. He glanced once more toward the maintenance badge hanging from her neck before returning his attention to the directors. "We have investors joining us within minutes," he said evenly. "We cannot afford distractions disguised as confidence." Several executives nodded immediately. Daniel Brooks, the chief strategy officer, adjusted the cuff of his navy jacket before speaking for the first time. "Richard is right. This presentation determines whether we secure the largest partnership in company history. We should focus on professionals." The word professionals lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Naomi heard it clearly, yet her expression remained unchanged. She knew the sentence was not really about qualifications. It was about perception. Margaret Collins continued watching everyone instead of speaking. After 30 years in corporate leadership, she had learned that people revealed their character most clearly when confronted by someone society expected them to overlook. Richard believed he was protecting the company. Daniel believed he was protecting efficiency. Neither of them noticed they had not asked Naomi a single question about what she actually knew. Their conclusions had arrived before the conversation even began. Near the far end of the table, Chief Financial Officer Emily Foster quietly reviewed the printed presentation resting in front of her. Something continued bothering her. Earlier that morning, she had discovered several projections that seemed unusually optimistic, but the meeting had moved too quickly for her to investigate further. She looked toward Naomi almost instinctively. The young woman had not once glanced nervously toward the exit. Instead, her attention remained fixed on one particular slide displaying revenue forecasts for the next 5 fiscal years. Emily noticed Naomi narrowing her eyes for only a brief second before gently pressing her thumb against the edge of the silver flash drive she still carried. It was not the gesture of someone pretending to understand complex financial models. It was the habit of someone carefully reviewing information already stored in memory. Richard stepped back toward the center of the room and folded his hands behind his back. "Thank you for your enthusiasm," he said with measured politeness that barely concealed his dismissal. "But this company has experts handling these matters." Naomi finally lifted her eyes to meet his. Her voice remained calm, respectful, and remarkably steady. "I believe your experts overlooked something that could cost Whitmore Dynamics far more than today's meeting." The room fell silent once again, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer driven by amusement. It carried the unmistakable weight of curiosity. Richard Whitmore let out a slow breath that sounded more impatient than concerned. "That is a very serious claim," he said, his voice smooth enough to hide the irritation growing beneath it. "And serious claims require serious credentials." His gaze drifted deliberately toward Naomi's visitor badge before returning to her face. "I do not believe maintenance staff are part of our strategic review process." A few quiet smiles appeared around the table, but they faded faster than before. The room no longer felt completely certain. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the projection screen where a colorful revenue forecast remained frozen beneath the company logo. Every chart was polished. Every percentage looked convincing. At first glance, it was exactly the kind of presentation investors expected to see. Then she quietly asked, "May I point to one slide?" Richard shook his head almost instantly. "No." The answer came so quickly that even Daniel Brooks looked surprised. Richard continued, "We have spent 6 months preparing this presentation. We are not stopping because someone cleaning conference rooms believes she discovered a problem." Naomi nodded once, accepting the interruption without resentment. "I understand." Her calm response somehow made the atmosphere even heavier. Emily Foster lowered the papers in front of her and glanced again at the financial projections. The concern she had noticed earlier returned stronger than before. Margaret Collins folded her hands together on the table, watching every expression in the room instead of the screen itself. Experience had taught her that confidence and correctness were not always the same thing. Outside, sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, filling the conference room with warm light that softened the polished wood and glass. Inside, however, the tension continued building. An executive assistant quietly entered carrying a tablet before stopping near the doorway. "The Horizon Capital delegation has arrived," she announced softly. "They are waiting in the executive lounge." Richard nodded without taking his eyes off Naomi. "Tell them we will begin in a few minutes." The assistant hesitated. They specifically asked whether the revised market forecast was ready. Richard answered confidently, "It is." Naomi looked toward him with genuine concern rather than defiance. "Sir, that is exactly the issue." Richard frowned. "Explain yourself." She gently lifted the silver flash drive she had carried since entering the room. "Yesterday evening I stayed after my father finished cleaning this floor because one of the conference computers would not synchronize correctly with the backup server. While checking the projector settings, the presentation automatically loaded from the local drive. I noticed the market growth assumptions were based on data released almost 3 months ago." Daniel Brooks immediately responded, "That is impossible. We updated every projection." Naomi met his eyes respectfully. "You updated the graphs." The underlying regional manufacturing index did not update because one external database stopped syncing after the software migration last month. Emily's head lifted almost instantly. She reached for her laptop and began typing. The quiet tapping of her keyboard became the only sound in the room. Richard crossed his arms. Coincidence. Anyone can repeat technical terms they overhear. Naomi did not argue. Instead, she spoke with remarkable precision. Slide 22 projects a 7.8% expansion in Midwest industrial demand over the next 18 months. The latest Commerce Department report reduced that estimate to 4.1%. If Horizon Capital discovers the discrepancy before your presentation ends, they may question every recommendation that follows. Emily suddenly stopped typing. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly as fresh data appeared across her screen. She compared 2 spreadsheets side by side, then slowly looked toward Margaret Collins. Neither woman said a word, but for the first time that morning, doubt had shifted away from Naomi and settled quietly. In front of the executives themselves, Emily Foster slowly turned her laptop so Margaret Collins could see the screen. Neither woman spoke at first. The updated economic report displayed in crisp blue lettering beside the company's internal forecast, and the difference between the two numbers was impossible to ignore. A quiet stillness settled over the boardroom, replacing the earlier laughter with something far heavier. Richard Whitmore noticed the exchange immediately. His confident posture stiffened for only a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Emily," he said firmly, "tell me that data is incomplete." Emily did not answer right away. She carefully refreshed the government database a second time, then a third. Each result returned exactly the same figures Naomi had quoted from memory. Daniel Brooks leaned closer, his expression tightening as he reviewed the screen himself. "That cannot be right," he murmured. "We verified every projection before final approval." Naomi remained beside the projector without taking a single step forward. She did not smile. She did not look satisfied. She simply watched the room begin asking the questions that should have been asked before judging her. Richard's jaw tightened. Years of leading high-pressure negotiations had taught him never to appear uncertain in front of investors or board members. He straightened his tie and spoke with renewed authority. "Even if one statistic changed, that does not invalidate an entire presentation." Naomi answered respectfully, "No, sir. One statistic does not." She paused briefly before continuing. "But that number feeds 17 separate assumptions across your financial model. Every projected revenue increase, hiring estimate, and expansion timeline depends on it." Several directors instinctively opened the printed reports lying in front of them. The quiet sound of turning pages spread around the room. Emily began following Naomi's explanation line by line, her eyes moving faster with every calculation. She highlighted one section after another until nearly half the presentation carried digital notes across her screen. Richard looked from Emily to Daniel, expecting one of them to dismiss the concern. Neither spoke. Outside the conference room, footsteps echoed faintly through the executive hallway as assistants prepared for the arrival of Horizon Capital's leadership team. Inside, the ticking wall clock suddenly seemed louder than before. Every passing second increased the pressure. Margaret Collins finally broke the silence. Emily, she asked calmly, how extensive is the impact? Emily inhaled slowly before answering. If these assumptions are outdated, the projected valuation presented this morning could be overstated by several $100 million over the next 5 years. The words landed with stunning force despite being spoken quietly. One board member removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another leaned back in complete disbelief. Daniel Brooks stared at the financial model he had personally approved, struggling to understand how the error had survived months of internal review. Richard felt every eye in the room beginning to shift away from Naomi and toward him. His reputation had always rested on certainty. Admitting uncertainty had never come naturally. He looked once more at the young woman wearing a maintenance badge and found himself confronting something he had refused to consider only minutes earlier. She had not interrupted the meeting to embarrass anyone. She had interrupted it to prevent a mistake. Yet pride remained a difficult habit to overcome. This meeting has already been delayed long enough, Richard said, his voice quieter now, but still guarded. Security will escort Miss Carter outside while the executive team reviews the numbers. Before anyone could move, Margaret Collins raised one hand. The simple gesture stopped the room instantly. Her eyes never left Richard as she spoke with calm authority. No one is escorting her anywhere. If Miss Carter found the problem, then Miss Carter stays until we understand every single one of these numbers. No one reached for the door. No one whispered another joke. The room that had seemed so certain only moments earlier now rested beneath a silence so complete that even the distant hum of the heating system felt unusually loud. Warm morning light poured through the towering windows, stretching across the polished conference table until it reached Naomi Carter's hands. She gently placed the silver flash drive beside the projector remote, not as someone claiming victory, but as someone preparing to help. Margaret Collins gave a small nod. "Miss Carter," she said softly, "show us what you found." Naomi took one careful breath before connecting the flash drive. The large display flickered for a second, replacing the company's polished presentation with a clean spreadsheet organized into simple sections. There were no flashy animations, no dramatic graphics, only carefully labeled data, clearly sourced reports, and handwritten notes that had been converted into digital comments. Every figure pointed back to a public record, every conclusion linked to verifiable evidence. The simplicity immediately caught the board's attention. Naomi stood beside the screen rather than in front of it, making sure everyone could read each number without obstruction. "The original strategy is strong," she began calmly. "The problem is not the vision. The problem is that the assumptions changed while the market changed faster." Her voice remained steady, never louder than necessary. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was trying to make certain no one misunderstood the facts. Emily Foster followed every line on her laptop, checking each source as Naomi spoke. One after another, every citation matched perfectly. Daniel Brooks slowly lowered the report he had defended only minutes earlier. He realized that Naomi was not attacking months of work. She had actually preserved it by identifying the one foundation that required correction before everything built upon it collapsed under scrutiny. Richard Whitmore remained standing at the head of the table, saying nothing. The confidence that usually filled the room around him had been replaced by quiet observation. For the first time since Naomi entered the boardroom, he listened without preparing an immediate response. He noticed details that had escaped him earlier. She never exaggerated. She never criticized anyone personally. Every statement focused on solving the problem rather than assigning blame. That unexpected humility unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the Chicago skyline before giving way once again to bright sunlight that reflected against neighboring glass towers. Inside, the changing light illuminated the conference room with a soft golden glow, making the expensive furniture and polished surfaces feel strangely less important than the thoughtful young woman calmly explaining complex financial relationships with remarkable clarity. Samuel Carter quietly pushed his maintenance cart past the closed conference room doors at the far end of the hallway, completely unaware that his daughter was speaking before the most influential leaders in the company he had faithfully cleaned for nearly 2 decades. He paused only long enough to straighten a welcome mat that had shifted slightly near the elevator, then continued down the corridor with the same quiet dignity he carried every day. Back inside the room, Naomi advanced to the final slide. Instead of ending with projected profits, it displayed one sentence across a white background. Accurate decisions begin with accurate information. She looked around the table before speaking one final time. If these updates are made today, your strategy remains strong. If they are ignored, your investors will discover them before lunch. The room remained perfectly still. No one applauded. No one interrupted. They simply looked at the screen, then back at Naomi, realizing that the maintenance badge they had noticed first had prevented them from seeing the extraordinary mind standing quietly behind it. Emily Foster slowly closed her laptop, then opened it again as though she hoped the numbers would somehow change on their own. They did not. Every independent source confirmed Naomi's analysis with remarkable consistency. One by one, the remaining board members began comparing printed reports against the updated data projected across the screen. Pens that had been used to underline investment opportunities were now marking corrections in the margins. The confidence that had filled the room less than an hour earlier had quietly transformed into respect for a truth no one could deny. Daniel Brooks leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. I reviewed this model 6 different times, he admitted quietly. I never thought to verify the external synchronization after the software migration. Emily nodded. Neither did I. We trusted the automated updates because they had never failed before. Naomi answered with gentle sincerity. Sometimes the smallest system errors stay invisible because everyone assumes someone else already checked them. No one interpreted her words as criticism. They sounded more like an observation shaped by humility than judgment. Richard Whitmore remained standing near the head of the table, his attention fixed on the final slide still glowing against the screen. Throughout his career, he had built a reputation for recognizing talent quickly. Yet the person who had just protected the company's future had been standing in front of him from the very beginning. He simply had not looked beyond the maintenance badge hanging around her neck. That realization settled heavily inside him. A soft knock interrupted the silence. The executive assistant stepped inside once more. The Horizon Capital delegation is ready, she said carefully. They are asking whether the presentation may begin. Margaret Collins looked toward Richard without saying a word. For the first time that morning, the decision belonged entirely to him. Richard glanced at the stack of outdated reports lying across the conference table before turning toward Naomi. The room waited. Even the city beyond the windows seemed strangely still beneath the bright afternoon sun. Finally, Richard spoke. How long would it take to update the presentation using your revised model? Naomi looked toward the screen, mentally reviewing every calculation she had prepared during countless evenings of study. 30 minutes, she answered. 40 if you would like every supporting citation included for investor questions. Emily looked up almost immediately. That is exactly what they will ask for. Daniel gave a slow nod. She is right. If we present corrected projections with documented sources, Horizon Capital will see that we identified the issue before they did. Richard lowered his eyes for a brief moment, something few people inside the company had ever witnessed. Pride had always come naturally to him. Admitting another person had been right required a different kind of strength. When he looked up again, the certainty in his expression had changed. It no longer came from believing he knew everything. It came from recognizing the importance of listening. He turned toward the board. Then we will postpone the meeting by 30 minutes. Several directors nodded in agreement without hesitation. Richard faced Naomi once again. Miss Carter, he said, his voice carrying none of the earlier mockery. I would like you to lead the revisions. For just a second, Naomi seemed surprised. Then she smiled softly, not because she had won an argument, but because the company now had an opportunity to avoid a costly mistake. She walked back toward the conference table, opened her notebook filled with carefully organized handwritten calculations, and placed it beside the official corporate reports. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One belonged to a student who had spent years studying after helping her father clean office floors. The other belonged to executives with decades of experience. Yet in that quiet boardroom, every person present finally understood that wisdom had never been determined by job titles, expensive offices, or the color of someone's skin. 35 minutes later, the conference room no longer carried the uneasy tension that had filled it earlier that morning. Fresh reports rested neatly in front of every board member, each page reflecting Naomi Carter's revised projections and carefully documented research. The investors from Horizon Capital had accepted the brief delay without complaint, appreciating the company's commitment to accuracy over speed. As the presentation began again, every question they raised was answered with confidence, supported by reliable data and transparent analysis. Instead of exposing weaknesses, the revised strategy demonstrated something even more valuable to experienced investors: integrity. By the end of the meeting, the delegation's lead partner stood, extended his hand toward Richard Whitmore, and smiled. "This is one of the most honest strategic presentations we have seen this year," he said. "Most companies would have hidden an error like this. Your team corrected it before asking us to make a decision. That earns our respect." A formal agreement worth hundreds of millions of dollars was signed before the afternoon ended. As the investors departed, quiet conversations filled the hallway outside the executive floor. Several directors gathered around Naomi, thanking her for her attention to detail and asking where she had learned financial modeling at such a high level. She answered each question with the same humility she had shown throughout the day. "From great professors, many library books, and a father who always reminded me that learning costs less than regret." Her words drew warm smiles instead of laughter. Richard remained standing near the conference table after everyone else began leaving. He watched Naomi organize her notebook with the same care she had shown while preparing her analysis. The worn edges of its pages contrasted sharply with the expensive leather portfolios scattered across the room. For the first time, he truly saw the determination hidden behind years of quiet perseverance. He walked toward the conference room doors and looked into the hallway. Samuel Carter was passing by with his maintenance card, unaware that the meeting had already become one of the most important moments in the company's history. Richard stepped outside, sincerely sorry. Samuel glanced toward Naomi, his eyes filled with quiet pride rather than surprise. He had always known who his daughter was long before anyone else did. Naomi smiled gently. There was no trace of bitterness in her expression. "Thank you for saying that," she answered softly. "We all make decisions based on what we notice first. The important part is choosing to notice more." Richard nodded slowly. "Would you consider joining Whitmore Dynamics after graduation?" Naomi looked at her father before answering. Samuel gave her the smallest encouraging smile. She turned back toward Richard. "I would be honored to contribute, as long as every good idea is given the chance to be heard, no matter who presents it." Richard extended his hand. This time, there was no hesitation from anyone watching. As Naomi shook his hand, the gesture carried far greater meaning than a job offer. It marked the moment when respect finally replaced assumption, and when a young black woman who had entered the room wearing a maintenance badge left having changed not only a company's future, but also the hearts of the people who led it. 3 months later, the first rays of autumn sunlight stretched across the glass entrance of Whitmore Dynamics, reflecting softly against the freshly polished floors that Samuel Carter had cared for with quiet pride for nearly 2 decades. Much of the building looked exactly as it always had. Employees hurried through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. Elevators chimed as they carried executives toward morning meetings. Receptionists welcomed visitors with familiar smiles. Yet something invisible had changed. People no longer walked past Samuel without acknowledging him. One by one, employees greeted him by name. Some stopped to ask about his family. Others thanked him for keeping the building beautiful. Small moments that once seemed insignificant had become daily reminders that dignity begins with seeing one another. Samuel smiled politely, never expecting recognition, but grateful that respect had finally replaced indifference. Upstairs, on the executive floor, a modest office overlooked the same Chicago skyline that Naomi Carter had admired from outside the boardroom only months earlier. The nameplate beside the door reflected the morning light with quiet elegance. Naomi Carter, Strategic Innovation Analyst. She had accepted the position after completing her semester, balancing her final classes with her new responsibilities. Her office remained surprisingly simple. Shelves filled with books replaced expensive decorations. A framed photograph of her and Samuel at her college graduation rested beside a small green plant growing toward the sunlight. The worn notebook she had carried into the boardroom that unforgettable morning still occupied the corner of her desk. She never replaced it. To her, those handwritten pages represented every late night, every train ride home, every sacrifice her father had quietly made so she could keep learning. Richard Whitmore often paused outside her office whenever important strategic meetings approached, not because he needed permission, but because he had developed a new habit of asking thoughtful questions before making final decisions. The company itself had begun changing as well. Internship applications were reviewed without photographs during the first stage of evaluation. Mentorship opportunities expanded to include students from neighborhoods that had rarely been represented inside the building. Managers received training focused not only on leadership, but also on recognizing talent beyond appearances and assumptions. None of those changes were announced with dramatic speeches. They simply became part of the company's culture, one decision at a time. During the annual shareholder meeting that winter, Richard stood before hundreds of investors and employees. Instead of beginning with financial results, he shared a lesson that surprised nearly everyone in the audience. Leadership is not about always being the smartest person in the room, he said. It is about creating a room where wisdom can be heard, no matter where it comes from. As he spoke, his eyes briefly met Naomi's across the auditorium. She answered with the same quiet smile she had worn from the beginning, never seeking attention for herself. That evening, after the celebration ended, Samuel and Naomi left the building together. The cold December air carried the familiar scent of snow drifting across the city. They walked slowly down the sidewalk beneath rows of glowing streetlights, saying very little. Words were unnecessary. Samuel looked up at the towering headquarters one last time before slipping his work gloves into his coat pocket. He had spent years believing his greatest achievement was keeping the building clean. Now he understood it had been raising a daughter whose kindness never disappeared, even after being underestimated. Naomi gently slipped her arm through his as they continued toward the train station. Behind them, the lights inside Whitmore Dynamics continued shining against the evening sky. Ahead of them, the tracks stretched into the distance, carrying the quiet promise that character will always travel farther than prejudice, and that true strength is revealed not by the power to look down on others, but by the courage to lift them up with respect, compassion, and grace.